Let's say you're a toy manufacturer who got in on the ground floor of the Japanese video game industry. You did decently for yourself, and for a short period, you were the biggest name in home video gaming. But then some plucky upstart came along and began really chewing into you, undercutting your prices, and using better technology. You dipped your toe into copying an American-style video game console, and that did okay for itself, but wasn't a smash hit. And then 2 years after you had that video game console market all to yourself, your rival jumps into that video game console market, along with a half a dozen other new competitors, and that rival's console becomes the biggest thing to hit Japan since Curry. Your already not doing so hot console collapses entirely. So what do you do? Well, in Epoch's case, you go super. "367 days after the Famicom's release, Epoch's Super Cassette Vision reached store shelves. July 17th, 1984. By that point, several of the 1983 consoles were already dead, and Nintendo and Sega had pretty much locked up the first and second place console positions. But maybe Epoch could dislodge them? Maybe Epoch could bring something special to the table that would let them stand shoulder to shoulder with those two titans of video games? No, of course not. The fact that this is likely the only YouTube video that you've ever seen on the Super Cassette Vision should tell you something about how this turned out. Epoch wound up falling into the position of third place console manufacturer. And if Sega had 10% of the market share that the Famicom did, and they didn't, Epoch had around 10% of what Sega had. But they were also the only other console manufacturer from that burst of systems to stay in the game for more than 2 years. Barely. The last Super Cassette Vision game was released in the holiday season of 1986. The actual release date for most Super Cassette Vision games is a little bit tough to pin down, but thanks to catalogs and advertisements, we've got a general idea within a couple of months for when they were actually released. One nice thing about the Super Cassette Vision cartridges is that it embraced the Famicom's style of making a rainbow. 2 cartridges sharing the same color is actually kind of rare on the system. And the boxes themselves are very durable. Even though they're cardboard boxes, you are intended to put your games away in them. And that actually makes it a bit easier to find Super Cassette Vision games with the packaging. There were 30 cartridges made for the Super Cassette Vision, and I am going to have to skip over one of them. Similar to Nintendo and Sega, Epoch created a programming tutorial for their system, Basic Numon. Well, since the Super Cassette Vision is so obscure, it's been impossible for me to source a copy of it. Fortunately, unlike the Cassette Vision, there is a functional emulator for the Super Cassette Vision, and I might have been able to use that to patch over this problem, but there's also no functional dump of the ROM of Basic Numon. So the Epoch of the Super Cassette Vision series is just going to be covering the games. If I get a copy later, I'll go back and fill it in. As a piece of tech, the Super Cassette Vision is an interesting setup. In some ways, it was much more advanced than the hardware that came out of the 1983 systems. It can do things that the Famicom couldn't dream of. But at the same time, it fell into many of the hardware pitfalls that a lot of those systems did, with the exception of Nintendo's Famicom. The system's architecture, at least, was much more conventional than the original cassette Visions. For one thing, the system actually had a CPU, an NEC microcontroller that ran at about 4 MHz. Pretty decent for the time. The real star of the system was Epoch's own homegrown video controller. It was a powerhouse for 1984, capable of handling 128 simultaneous sprites. It even had a small demo program built in to show this off. Yeah, these balloons might not look like much, but in 1984, you needed a powerful system to pull this off. The video controller had a massive amount of internal RAM for the time, allowing it to track the position and color of all of those sprites. That said, there were 2 problems with the video controller. First, the palette was limited to 16 colors. And unlike the Famicom, you couldn't use different palettes. Those 16 colors were all you had. It's restrictive, but most computers and consoles were similarly limited at the time. The bigger issue is that it had no capability for background graphics. The Super Cassette Vision was capable of making bars of solid color, and that was it. By making those bars small enough, they could create a starfield effect, but the backgrounds were fairly limited. With no capability to do backgrounds, that also meant it really didn't have any capability of doing scrolling. And the native scrolling was one of the Famicom's big advantages. Later Super Cassette Vision games dealt with this by creating the background out of the sprite bank, since 128 sprites is a massive amount. There was a limitation to the sprites, though. If you wanted 128 of them, you were limited to one color. Well, two including the transparency. However, right from the start, Epoch was taking advantage of this by layering sprites of different colors. Every additional color you wanted in a sprite reduced the number of available sprites by one, but when you had 128 sprites to work with, that didn't matter. The net result of all of this meant that Super Cassette Vision games often had way more things flying around the screen than you would see on other systems. And sometimes they were even more colorful, even accounting for the more restricted color palette. Another special thing about that video chip is that it allowed for much cleaner video output. In fact, it allowed for an RGB signal output. The Super Cassette Vision wound up being the first video game console to have RGB out as a native option. All you need is the correct cable. The signal is a little bit unsteady. That's the outside of having a really odd video resolution and then passing it through a converter. But the image is very clean. Definitely better than you'd get out of any console from the mid-80s without modifying it. That video chip was the Super Cassette Vision's strength, but what about its weaknesses? And that would be everything else. The easiest one for someone watching a video to notice is going to be the sound. The advertisements for the Super Cassette Vision called its audio capabilities Hokushin no Real Sound, or Realistic Real Sound if you don't mind the redundant translation. This is wildly overstating the machine's capabilities. It had a single digital audio channel. Now that single channel was capable of integrating 3 square wave signals, and Epoch took advantage of that to include some digitized voices in some games. But only having one output channel meant that it was impossible to effectively include music in games. They could play a tune, but it had to cut out when a sound effect happened. And only having square waves, and by extension random noise, also greatly limited the quality of sound for the system. Yes, they could digitize anything, but digitized sound was very memory intensive for 1984. The cartridges just didn't have the space to include all of the digital sound effects they needed. The lack of even a sine wave sound effect channel severely limited what the Super Cassette Vision could sound like. And then we come to the biggest problem with the Super Cassette Vision: the controllers. The Super Cassette Vision had 2 hardwired controllers that fit into a little compartment at the front of it. These controllers had a nubby 4-way joystick and 2 separate buttons, one on the left, one on the right. If you ever need to know what the controls in the game did, well, they printed that on the front of the cartridge. The controllers are incredibly mushy and unresponsive. Some of that might be 40 years of aging on this system, but they're also small enough that adult hands can't handle them properly. And then there's the leverage problem. You're going to be holding a controller in one hand and moving the joystick with the other. This whole system is essentially a lever, and as you push the joystick, you're also twisting the whole controller out of your hand. It's not so bad when you're pushing in a direction where it twists into your hand. That would be the direction opposite of the hand you're holding it in. But when you twist it out, it makes the already relatively unresponsive buttons even more difficult to push. It's bad controller design, and the fact that they're hardwired means that any solution that you want to use, like, say, replacing the controllers with Famicom controllers, means direct modifications to the system. The Super Cassette Vision also included what they called the select buttons, a numeric keypad similar to a phone's that was actually on the console. In almost every game, this is used solely for selecting which game mode you're going to play, but they did build it with the option of having an overlay on it that would label these buttons for additional functions. Only one game used an overlay. The pause button is also built directly into the console, though no games use that for any alternate functions. For such a clunky system that sold almost no units, the Super Cassette Vision wound up punching well above its weight class. There's a surprising number of firsts on this platform, and even when they aren't firsts, they were often second by only a few months. There's also several ports of games to the system that were unique for the time, sometimes the only way that a game was available on a console in Japan, and for at least one historical game, the only way that you could play it on a console at all for another 10 years. There's also several Super Cassette Vision games that at that exact moment when they were released could outdo what you'd find on any other system, and then technology rapidly moved past them. The Super Cassette Vision is fascinating as one of video games' greatest also-rans. A console that almost, but not quite, reached the heights. It's the console that made Epoch the third-place manufacturer of home video game systems in Japan. Let's take a look at their games and see how things went wrong, but how it also almost went right.